This episode of the animated series, Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig. Mom is no longer the same. The day was gray and rainy. The clouds hung low over the pig family's house, the wind shook the trees, and raindrops drummed against the windows. Daddy Pig had gone out on business, and Mummy Pig went shopping, leaving Peppa and George at home. They played in the living room, building towers out of blocks, but something felt off. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Time dragged on. It was getting dark outside, but Mummy Pig still hadn't returned. Then the lock clicked. The children jumped. The door slowly creaked open. Mummy Pig stepped inside, but something was wrong. Her movements were slow, uneven, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't shake off the rain, didn't take off her boots, didn't say a word. She just stood there, unblinking, staring at the children. The living room grew cold. The air thickened with a strange heaviness, like the moment before a storm. Peppa squeezed George's hand. Mummy Pig's eyes weren't the same. The whites had turned too pale, almost gray, and her pupils had dilated so much that her eyes looked like two black voids. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It hung slightly open. Her lips twitched as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Peppa waited for Mummy to speak, but she just stood there. Then, she stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground at all. The lights in the room flickered as though the air had thickened, turning heavier. Mummy Pig moved again. But now her movements became unnatural, fluid, like a puppet suspended on strings. Her head tilted slowly, and in the dim light, Peppa noticed something strange. Something was moving beneath her skin. Dark shapes slithered under the surface of her face, as if hundreds of tiny creatures were living inside. Peppa shivered, but the worst came in the next moment. Mummy Pig lunged forward, suddenly like a broken doll. Her whole body jerked forward, and her mouth stretched open wider than should be possible. Peppa heard a sound for the first time. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a chorus of hundreds of voices speaking at once. The house shuddered. The curtains twisted with writhing shadows, the walls cracked, and from the gaps in the floorboards, a black liquid seeped out. Mummy Pig rose above the ground. Her arms elongated, her fingers became too thin, and from her mouth something slipped out, black, writhing, alive. The shadows in the room folded into a single mass and swarmed forward. Peppa screamed, but there was no sound. All she could hear were footsteps coming closer, the footsteps of something that was no longer Mummy Pig.
Peppa Pig, Eyes in the Dark. In the pig family's house, an unusual silence reigned. Lately, George had hardly spoken to his sister. He no longer played with his dinosaur, didn't ask for bedtime stories, and didn't laugh the way he used to. Instead, he spent long hours sitting at the table by the window, clutching a pencil. Sheets of paper were scattered everywhere, on the floor, on the chair, even by the bed. All of them were covered with the same strange symbols, circles with short lines, resembling eyes. "George, what are these drawings?" Peppa asked cautiously. Her brother slowly turned to her. His gaze was unusual, heavy, and somehow too grown up. "You'll find out soon," he whispered, and bent over the papers again. Peppa felt her little hooves grow cold. George was becoming more and more withdrawn, as if his attention was fixed on something she couldn't see. One night, when they were both already lying in their beds, Peppa noticed that George wasn't asleep. He sat right on his sheets, staring at the ceiling. His eyes shimmered strangely, reflecting the moonlight. But there was no warmth in that gleam. It felt as if a bottomless depth was hiding inside them, one she could fall into. "George," Peppa whispered. He didn't answer. He only smiled, in a way he had never smiled before. The next morning, George's bed was empty. His favorite dinosaur lay torn to pieces on the floor. Above his pillow, on the wall, scratches had appeared. Symbols like eyes, as if someone had carved them with a sharp claw. "George!" Peppa called. But the room remained silent. She rushed through the house, searching for her brother in the garden, the kitchen, the living room. But George was nowhere. Everything around her felt too quiet, as if time itself had stopped. When Peppa returned to their room, her eyes fell on the large mirror hanging on the wall. Her heart froze. In the reflection behind her stood George. She spun around quickly. No one was there. But in the mirror, he remained, staring. His eyes glowed with a dim, sickly light, and his lips stretched into a smile. Peppa backed away, and then she noticed that next to George in the reflection sat Labubu. The toy looked almost the same as always, but its eyes flickered with a red glow. On its face lingered the same eerie smile as George's. "George is no more," came a strange voice from the mirror. It was low, drawn out, and echoed both in the room and inside her head. Peppa pressed herself to the wall. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. The shapes of George and Labubu moved forward, toward the glass. Their outlines became sharper, as if they were about to break through. "No!" Peppa screamed. She dashed toward the door, but suddenly froze. In the mirror, her own bed reflected as empty. And on it sat Labubu, very close now, with glowing eyes and a crooked smile. The mirror trembled, and the shadows nearly tore their way out. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look. When she opened them again, the mirror was ordinary. The room was silent. Only George's bed remained empty. Later that night, when their parents had gone to sleep, Peppa sat on her bed, staring at the shelf where Labubu now stood again. He looked harmless, soft, and familiar. But now she knew the truth. His eyes were no longer lifeless buttons. In their dim glow flickered the same cold emptiness she had seen in George. And in the corner of the room, near the mirror, a crack was slowly spreading. It widened as if something unseen was watching from behind the wall.
Peppa Pig. Something in the house. The evening at the Pig household was unusually quiet. Peppa and George played in the living room while rain tapped softly against the windows. The dim light flickered and a strange tension filled the air. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the trees like eerie whispers in the night. Shadows from the flickering television danced against the walls, elongating into strange, distorted shapes. Then the door creaked open. Peppa turned quickly, her heartbeat quickening. The door had been closed. She was sure of it. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig entered, but something was wrong. Their movements were too smooth, too silent, as if they glided rather than walked. Their eyes were empty, hollow voids, and their smiles were unnaturally wide, frozen in place like grotesque masks. The room grew cold. A chill seeped into Peppa's bones, numbing her fingertips. The air thickened, pressing against her chest, as if the room itself were alive. George clutched his dinosaur tighter, his little fingers trembling. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unseen dread. Daddy Pig's head twisted at an impossible angle, his neck creaking and popping as he turned 180 degrees to stare at them. Mummy Pig's posture shifted unnaturally, her body bending too far forward, her arms dangling lifelessly at her sides like a broken puppet. Then came the sound. A rhythmic click-clack of hooves echoed through the hallways, slow and deliberate. The footsteps did not belong to anyone they knew. Peppa grabbed George's hand, her grip firm, and without hesitation they bolted upstairs. Their feet pounded against the wooden steps, the house groaning beneath them. Peppa reached their bedroom, yanked George inside, and slammed the door shut, twisting the lock with shaking fingers. Silence. The handle began to turn, softly at first, then with more force. Peppa pressed her back against the door, willing it to hold. Then, a slow, deliberate scratching at the wood. It was faint, methodical, like nails dragging just beneath the surface. A breathy whisper followed, an exhale too close, too deliberate. The shadows in the room began to shift, stretching along the walls in odd, angular shapes, pulsing as though the walls themselves were alive. The air grew colder still, wrapping around them like unseen fingers. Peppa felt her heart hammer against her ribs, her breath shallow and rapid. The house no longer felt like home. It had become something else, something dark, something watching, something waiting. And in the suffocating silence, Peppa knew they were not alone. This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, the room that wasn't there. The day in the Pig family's house was as usual. Peppa and George were playing in the living room, while Mummy Pig was cooking dinner, and Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Everything was familiar, cozy. But in the evening, something strange happened. When Peppa went upstairs to her room, she noticed a door at the end of the hallway. It had never been there. The house wasn't that big, and Peppa knew exactly where everything was. At the end of the hallway, there had always been just a wall, but now there was a door. Ordinary-looking, wooden, with a round handle. George followed her, looking confused. A cold feeling settled inside Peppa. Maybe Mummy and Daddy had remodeled something. Maybe it had always been there and she just hadn't noticed. But the longer she stared, the more wrong it seemed. She had never heard anyone building anything new. And yet, the door was there. It was calling to be opened. Peppa cautiously reached for the handle. Inside was a room. Empty, bare walls, a dusty wooden floor. But the air inside was heavy, stale, as if no one had stepped inside for a very, very long time. Peppa took a step forward. Silence. But there was a feeling like someone was there. Like someone had just been standing in that corner and moved the moment she entered. George tugged at her hoof, but Peppa didn't move. Something was wrong. They couldn't hear the television from the living room. They couldn't hear their parents' footsteps. Only silence. And then, a step. Peppa turned sharply, but the room was empty. Complete suffocating stillness. And then, the door began to close. Slowly, soundlessly, as if someone was pushing it from the other side. Peppa and George lunged for the exit, but too late. The door slammed shut. Darkness. The room had no window, no drafts, not even a crack of light. Only absolute darkness and silence. Peppa yanked at the handle. It wouldn't budge. George curled into a ball, clutching his dinosaur tightly. And then Peppa heard breathing. Deep. Quiet, not hers, not George's. Someone else was in this room. Something was standing in the dark, very close. The vanished house. One morning, Peppa and her family woke up in their usual home. Daddy Pig was warming up breakfast, Mummy Pig was making tea, and George was playing with his toys. Everything was calm, but when Peppa decided to step outside, she noticed something strange. Outside the window, there was no familiar green yard, and the sky looked dull and gray. Peppa went to the door and opened it. There was no sound, no people, just darkness. The yard was gone, and the house itself seemed to be surrounded by a dark, endless space. The walls of the house began to slowly disappear, as if dissolving into the air. Peppa tried to return inside, but the door slammed shut, and everything inside turned dark. She screamed and ran back to her parents, but they were sitting as if nothing had happened. Daddy Pig was still reading the newspaper, and Mummy Pig was still making tea. Peppa tried to tell them what had happened outside, but they didn't hear her. Then Peppa noticed that everyone in the house seemed strange. Daddy Pig no longer laughed, and Mummy Pig wasn't smiling. In search of answers, Peppa decided to step outside again. This time, when she stepped out, she found herself in an empty world. Everything around her was gray, with no trees or familiar buildings. Peppa turned around and saw the house she had lived in disappearing. turning into mist. In panic, she rushed back into the house, but now everything inside was as empty and gloomy as it was outside. Mummy and Daddy Pig were sitting in dark corners, their faces strange and lifeless. Then Peppa realized that her house was gone, and perhaps she was too. There were no traces of her family, nothing familiar. Everything had disappeared.
Peppa Pig, the cracks. It started as just a tiny line, almost invisible in the corner of Peppa's bedroom. She thought it was just a crack in the paint. Maybe someone had bumped into the wall. "Mummy, look," she said that evening, pointing. Mummy Pig glanced over, nodded and said, "The house has probably settled a bit. Nothing to worry about. Daddy will fix it." But Daddy forgot, and the crack stayed. The next day, Peppa noticed it had grown longer. Now it stretched upward slightly, like a tree branch reaching toward the ceiling. "That's strange," she muttered. "Maybe I'm imagining it." But each day, the crack grew, first thin, then a little wider. After a few days, it curved unnaturally, like someone had drawn it with a finger. More cracks appeared nearby, one, then another. "Is our house okay?" Peppa asked Daddy Pig. "Of course," he laughed. "Walls crack sometimes. We'll fix it." They never did. A week later, the whole wall was laced with thin cracks. Some of them vanished during the day, only to return by night. One night, Peppa woke up and saw the crack moving, slightly, as if something inside was breathing. She got out of bed and walked closer, pressed her ear against it. Inside, a sound. Very quiet, scraping. A knock, slow, 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. Peppa jumped back. "George," she whispered. Her brother was asleep, breathing steadily. In the morning, she found a small, dusty scrap of paper beneath the crack, very old, almost falling apart. On it, a single word, "Open." Peppa didn't tell her parents. She covered the crack with bandages, several layers, then hung a picture over it. But by nightfall, the picture had fallen. The tape was torn away. New lines appeared on the wall, not cracks anymore, almost like letters. She backed away to the door, but the door wouldn't open. Something inside the wall was moving, slowly, like it was exhaling. She screamed. Mummy and Daddy rushed in. It's," Peppa gasped, pointing. But on the wall, nothing, no cracks, no words, just a perfectly smooth surface. "You probably had a bad dream," said Mummy Pig gently. "Let's try to forget about it." But Peppa couldn't forget, because that night, when she turned to face the wall, she saw movement right where the crack had been, and then a voice, a whisper. "I'm almost out. Don't turn around."
Peppa Pig. Mom is no longer the same. The day was gray and rainy. The clouds hung low over the pig family's house, the wind shook the trees, and raindrops drummed against the windows. Daddy Pig had gone out on business, and Mummy Pig went shopping, leaving Peppa and George at home. They played in the living room, building towers out of blocks, but something felt off. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Time dragged on. It was getting dark outside, but Mummy Pig still hadn't returned. Then the lock clicked. The children jumped. The door slowly creaked open. Mummy Pig stepped inside. But something was wrong. Her movements were slow, uneven, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't shake off the rain, didn't take off her boots, didn't say a word. She just stood there, unblinking, staring at the children. The living room grew cold. The air thickened with a strange heaviness, like the moment before a storm. Peppa squeezed George's hand. Mummy Pig's eyes weren't the same. The whites had turned too pale, almost gray, and her pupils had dilated so much that her eyes looked like 2 black voids. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It hung slightly open. Her lips twitched as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Peppa waited for Mummy to speak, but she just stood there. Then she stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground at all. The lights in the room flickered as though the air had thickened, turning heavier. Mummy Pig moved again. But now her movements became unnatural, fluid, like a puppet suspended on strings. Her head tilted slowly, and in the dim light, Peppa noticed something strange. Something was moving beneath her skin. Dark shapes slithered under the surface of her face, as if hundreds of tiny creatures were living inside. Peppa shivered, but the worst came in the next moment. Mummy Pig lunged forward, suddenly like a broken doll. Her whole body jerked forward, and her mouth stretched open wider than should be possible. Peppa heard a sound for the first time. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a chorus of hundreds of voices speaking at once. The house shuddered. The curtains twisted with writhing shadows. The walls cracked, and from the gaps in the floorboards, a black liquid seeped out. Mummy Pig rose above the ground. Her arms elongated, her fingers became too thin, and from her mouth something slipped out, black, writhing, alive. The shadows in the room folded into a single mass and swarmed forward. Peppa screamed, but there was no sound. All she could hear were footsteps coming closer, the footsteps of something that was no longer Mummy Pig. This episode of the animated series Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV.
Peppa Pig, the letters on the wall. It started with a single phrase, a small message, as if scratched by something blunt. On the wall by the stairs, right under the handrail. Daddy Pig first thought George had been playing with a sharp toy block. "Who wrote this?" he asked at breakfast. "Not me," said George. "Me neither," added Peppa. "What does it say?" Daddy Pig frowned. "You forgot me." They thought it was just a childish prank. Mummy Pig wiped the wall with a damp cloth, and the writing disappeared. But the next morning, it showed up again, somewhere else, near the kitchen door. Same words. "You forgot me." "Mummy," said Peppa, "maybe it's leftover chalk. Or someone's drawing at night." "No one's drawing, Peppa. It's just a coincidence." But on the third day, the writing was in Peppa and George's room, right next to the bed, written by a small hoof, tiny letters, crooked pressure, as if whoever wrote it was rushing or didn't know how to hold the chalk. "I didn't write it," Peppa repeated. "I swear." "Maybe you just don't remember," Mummy said gently. "Maybe it happened in a dream." But Peppa hadn't been asleep. She remembered clearly. And that night, she woke up to a soft sound, a scratchy noise, dry, like something scraping against plaster. She sat up and saw the bedroom door slightly open. Light from the hallway fell on the wall, and there, in the shadow, something moved. Peppa couldn't see a face, only a hoof, scraping against the wall again and again. When she turned on her nightlight, the figure was gone. But a new message had appeared. "You erased me." Now the writing showed up every day, in the bathroom, on the wardrobe, under the table, even on the inside of the window glass, all written by one hoof, all saying the same thing. "Who is it?" Peppa asked George. "Maybe it's someone you forgot," he whispered. On the sixth night, Peppa woke up and saw someone writing on the wall right in front of her bed. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The figure didn't turn around, just a shadow, a shape, and when the message was finished, it melted into the darkness, quiet, smooth. "You were me." Peppa shivered. Her eyes moved to the mirror, and she saw a reflection, herself, almost. But the one in the mirror didn't move, didn't blink, just stared, and words began to appear on the glass. "You took my place." In the morning, Mummy Pig called her for breakfast. "Peppa, aren't you hungry?" Peppa didn't reply. She didn't feel like herself anymore. And on the wall above the table appeared one final message, written in that same crooked hoof writing. "Now you are forgotten."
This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, voices on the second floor. It was a late evening in the Pig family's house. The wind howled outside, rushing through the dark streets. Rain drummed against the roof, trickling down the windows in thin streams. Everything seemed like a normal rainy night, yet something in the air felt wrong. Peppa and George sat in the living room, wrapped in warm blankets. The television flickered with a silly program, but neither of them could focus on the screen. The house was too quiet. Even the sound of the rain felt muted, as if the walls had thickened. Then they heard it. Voices. They came from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking on the second floor and talking. But they both knew that Mummy and Daddy Pig had already gone to bed. Their door was closed. There was no one else in the house. Peppa froze. George clutched his dinosaur. The voices were muffled but clear. The words were indistinct, yet it was obvious that someone was speaking. A whisper, a quiet laugh, slow footsteps, the floor creaking under the weight. Peppa lifted her head, staring at the staircase. The second floor was swallowed by darkness. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the top step was sinking into a void. The voices didn't stop. They sounded wrong, like someone was pretending to sound familiar, but was failing. The voices grew closer. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. And then they began to descend. Step, pause, step, pause. Something was coming down. Peppa and George didn't move. Their hearts pounded so loudly that it felt like the whole house could hear them. But the worst was yet to come. When it reached the middle of the staircase, the upstairs light flickered. For a brief moment, they saw a shadow, tall, stretched, and completely still. The footsteps continued. The voices were right there. Peppa couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed George's hoof and squeezed her eyes shut. And suddenly, everything stopped. No more footsteps, no more voices, only silence. Peppa slowly opened her eyes. The top of the stairs was empty, but she knew that something was still there. It just didn't want to be seen.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Mummy Pig was preparing dinner, but the food on the table began to move on its own. The carrots wriggled like worms, the potatoes pulsed with a faint, internal light, and the peas rolled off the plate and scurried across the floor like tiny, green insects. The familiar aroma of cooking was replaced by a strange, earthy smell, mixed with something sweet and sickly. Peppa and George watched in horror as the vegetables began to coalesce, forming a grotesque, pulsating mass in the center of the table. It grew larger, slowly taking on a vaguely humanoid shape, with two glowing green eyes emerging from its surface. Mummy Pig, her back turned, continued to hum, oblivious to the monstrous transformation occurring behind her. The kitchen grew cold, and the familiar sounds of cooking were replaced by a faint, squelching noise. The monstrous vegetable creature began to twitch, then to rise, its form dripping with a viscous, green liquid. It let out a low, guttural groan, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The kitchen, once a place of nourishment, was now a scene of unimaginable horror. The familiar comfort of their home was replaced by a chilling sense of dread, as the food they were about to eat transformed into a living nightmare. The creature took a step, its root-like feet squelching on the tiled floor. It reached out a tendril, its glowing eyes fixed on Peppa. The house was no longer safe, for a monstrous hunger had awakened within its walls. The familiar comfort of their dinner time had become a terrifying encounter with a sentient, malevolent entity. The food was alive and it was hungry.
Peppa Pig, the new friend. One sunny morning, Peppa and George were playing in the garden when a strange piglet approached them. He had pale gray skin, odd eyes with a reddish tint, and a quiet, muffled voice. "Hi, I'm Simon," he said with a smile. "Hi, Simon." "Do you want to play with us?" Peppa asked cheerfully. Simon nodded, but his smile seemed a little off to Peppa. George also looked uneasy, but they decided Simon was just their new friend. At first, they played harmless games. Simon suggested hide and seek, but chose the strangest hiding places, like behind the trees where no one ever hid. When George tried to find him, he suddenly heard a whisper behind him, even though Simon should have been far away. "It's just a game," Simon said, stepping out from the shadows. By evening, things got even stranger. Simon asked to stay for dinner, and Mummy Pig invited him to join. "Are you from the next village?" Mummy Pig asked. "I'm from far away," Simon replied quietly, not taking his eyes off his plate. During dinner, he hardly ate, and instead stared at everyone, especially Peppa. After the family went to bed, Peppa noticed Simon still standing in the garden, staring at the house. The next day, Simon came back. He started inviting Peppa and George to play unsettling games. One game was called Look into the Dark. Simon led them into a dark corner of the shed and said, "Look closely. You'll see something interesting." But instead of something fun, Peppa felt a chilling cold, and Simon's shadow in the darkness seemed to move on its own. One evening, Peppa heard whispering outside her bedroom door. She cautiously peeked out and saw Simon standing in the hallway. His eyes were now glowing red. "Peppa, come with me. We'll be best friends forever," he whispered. Terrified, Peppa called for her parents, but when they arrived, Simon was gone. The next day, George disappeared. All they found was his toy dinosaur, abandoned in the garden. Simon appeared again and said, "Don't worry, he's with me. He's happy." Peppa realized Simon wasn't a friend, but something far more sinister. She tried to make him leave, but he just smiled and said, "You're next."